Good evening from Washington, D.C. I am Julia Changblock, President of the U.S.-China Education Trust. Our webinar today, commemorating the 50th anniversary of President Nixon's visit to China, is timely. It is important to remember on the day when Vladimir Putin of Russia invaded Ukraine, that diplomacy can work. Our speakers today, hopefully, will show us how Nixon's visit in 1972 managed to do it. 50 years ago, China had been closed to America and the world for almost a quarter century. The US and China were avowed enemies. When President Nixon brought China, the Chinese people, Chinese pandas, into the homes and living rooms of Americans across the country and people around the world. Almost overnight, I remember China becoming all the rage. Anything Chinese, food, art, music, even those ill-fitting blue Mao suits became fashionable. Almost everyone, certainly everyone I knew, wanted to visit China, to enter, to experience the Forbidden Kingdom. Deteriorating relations, however, are turning the two countries once again increasingly into enemies. If we want a better and safer world for ourselves, our children, and our grandchildren, we will need another bold move to reset the relationship. Given Russia's invasion of Ukraine today, the stakes couldn't be higher. Our speakers will discuss how the Nixon visit is relevant today. But we do know that the 1972 rapprochement between the US and China was in part aimed at countering the Soviet Union. It is symbolic that half a century later, at this moment, it is China and Russia that are drawing closer and signing agreements on their limitless cooperation, supporting each other on the Ukraine, Taiwan, and much more. Are we seeing not only a new Cold War looming with Russia and China aligned against the US and the West? And worse, is a hot war on the horizon, because Putin, in one of his speeches, alluded to Russia's nuclear weapons. I think we all hope not. But let me not take up more valuable time and see what our speakers have to say. Before I hand over the mic, I would like to say just a few words about our esteemed moderator, renowned China scholar Harry Harding, who is currently University Professor and Professor of Public Policy at the University of Virginia, where he was the founding dean of the university's Frank Batten School of Leadership and Public Policy. He was also the dean of the Eliot School of George Washington University, with which the U.S.-China Education Trust is now affiliated. We're delighted that so many of our GW colleagues have joined this webinar, including, I believe, the Dean of the Eliot School. We are proud, I might say finally, that Professor Harding is also an advisory council member of the U.S.-China Education Trust, as is Nicholas Platt, USET's chairman and one of our speakers today. I do have one piece of very bad news. I just got a note from Professor Wang Jishi of Peking University, who is here in Washington, D.C., so near yet so far. He wrote that and apologizes that he cannot be with us today because he's absolutely exhausted from his day's activities. He's just not feeling too well. So we'll have to do without him. And we hope that we will hear from him. And if any of you have questions for him, I am sure that we'd be happy to collect them and send it to him to possibly respond to you. I know that does not make up for his not being here. However, that's what it is. So without further ado, Harry Harding, it's all yours.
Well, thank you much, Leah. And good evening to everyone tuning in from the East Coast of the United States. Good morning to all of you joining us from Asia. And I think we have a very, very interesting webinar in store for you today. Before I introduce the participants, the speakers, one by one, let me give you a sense of introduction to the overall program. As Julia has said, we are here to commemorate and to discuss two interconnected but somewhat different events. One is the visit by President Nixon, his entourage, to China in February 1972, which established face-to-face, highest-level contact between two countries, two important countries that had been mutually isolated for so long. Secondly, at the conclusion of that series of meetings, a very important document was signed, the Shanghai Communique, which was an extraordinary diplomatic document in terms of its structure as well as its content. And we'll be talking more about that later. In assembling our panel of specialists today, Julia has put together people who were all involved one way or another in those series of events, the trip itself and the negotiation and signing of the dialogue, of the communique, except for me. I was simply watching it from the West Coast of the United States from my position at Stanford University, where I was a young assistant professor at the time and was glued to my television screen throughout. But the people who will be speaking here today had direct experience with those important events and that important document. In the order in which they appear across the top of my screen, first of all, we have Ambassador Chaz Freeman, a career Foreign Service officer who, among other positions, was the Assistant Secretary of Defense for International Security Affairs. Next, we have Ambassador Nicholas Platt, ambassador to the Philippines, and most recently, president of the Asia Society in New York. He was there as a State Department official. He accompanied Secretary of State Rogers to his meetings with his Chinese counterpart, so participated in the negotiations at still another level and from a different perspective. The way we're going to structure the discussion today is basically going to divide it into two broad parts that will deal with first, basically the trip itself and the negotiation of the communique. So we'll be hearing from those who were there, from their perspectives at the time about how the trip unfolded and how the communique and the meetings that produced it were conducted. Secondly, in the second half of our program, we're going to be looking at the broader implications. First of all, how the trip and the communique affected the future course of the US-China relationship from 1972 onward. And then finally, we'll be looking at the question of what lessons the trip and the communique might hold for the future evolution of US-China relations, especially as Ambassador Block has just told us, they show how two estranged countries can, under the right circumstances and given the right leadership, can begin to put their formerly confrontational relationship on a more cooperative and even collaborative course. I want to thank Julia for her leadership of the U.S.-China Education Trust for putting this program together. And we will conclude with some concluding commentary by Julia, and she will address yet a different perspective, the perspective of the Chinese American community watching what was happening in China and in Beijing from wherever they were in the United States. So with that as a kind of a roadmap to where we're going, let's get started. And I'm going to turn first to Chaz Freeman, for 8 minutes of comments on the trip itself. I'm going to give each of the speakers a 1-minute warning because we want to have plenty of time for Q&A at the end of our webinar, and we'll tell you more about how to submit your questions in due course. So Chaz, over to you.
Thank you, Harry. It's a pleasure to be here. For me, this trip actually began when I fled the course on taxation at the Harvard Law School to the Widener Library and began to read history and got very interested in China without knowing anything about the extensive previous involvement of my family in the country. My reasoning was very simple. The United States, China, and the Soviet Union were at loggerheads. China had, for a time, leaned to one side, the Soviet side. That alliance had not worked out. We had no relationship with China, and I was convinced we would have to reach out to China for geopolitical reasons. And I thought it would be nice if I had good luck to be there. This had a great deal to do with when and why I joined the United States Foreign Service. I was assigned first to India. I managed to learn Tamil, but never reported that to the department, so I was able to go on and try to learn Chinese. I did that beginning in 1969, first in Washington and then in Taichung in Taiwan. And interestingly, unlike my peers, I really didn't want to go to the mainland. I was interested in what was happening in Taiwan, and I spent most of my time in the latter part learning Taiwanese and a bit of Hakka with a view to serving in Taiwan. Ironically, as I say, I ended up being the first of the members of my class to go to China. I was suddenly pulled out. Well, first I was told that I'd been selected to be the interpreter for the Warsaw talks, 136 of which occurred first in Geneva and then in Warsaw. The final Warsaw talks, as I discovered when I went to read the record, had included an offer by the United States to send a special emissary to Beijing and to discuss a presidential visit to Beijing. Suddenly, I was called back to Washington to work on what was then called Asian Communist Affairs, since we couldn't use the word China, on writing a whole bunch of papers, which mysteriously disappeared and did not go through the system that Nick Platt was running in the Secretary of State's office, but directly to NSC officers John Holdridge and Richard Solomon, and thence to Henry Kissinger. I knew there was a special emissary in the works. I did not know it was Kissinger. So that was a surprise when Nixon announced this on July 15, 1971. As the year went on, that year, 1971, there were various iterations of the communique worked out. I saw a bootleg copy or two. And sometime in, I think, late November, early December, I was locked up in the operations center under Nick's supervision. Occasionally, he would come around to make sure we weren't causing too much trouble, and supposedly inform the Secretary of State about what we were doing and what was happening, although I gathered at the time that the Secretary wasn't terribly interested. I'm told that I wrote 47%, I don't know how they calculated that, of the briefing papers for the president. Nick at one point intervened because the stuff that I and a couple of other people were writing for the president was being sent to the White House, where they would retype the first page and take credit for the papers. And Nick invented something called Department of State briefing paper stationery, which meant that they had to retype the whole thing. That we got a little bit of credit for what we were doing. I didn't know what I was to do, if anything, on the trip or during it, until some baggage tags were suddenly shoved through the mail slot at my house in Cleveland Park. And somebody gave me a copy of Time magazine, in which I was inaccurately profiled as the interpreter for the trip. We got on the plane at Andrews, went out to California, picked up some redwood trees for presentation by the president in Hangzhou, which was the intermediate stop between Beijing and Shanghai, and stopped in Hawaii, where I think Nick and I tried valiantly to get the Secretary of State up to speed on the trip before he went off to play golf, which he enjoyed greatly. We then stopped in Guam for a night and then ended up in Shanghai, where I met my first Chinese communist official, for whom I was the first American official he had encountered. And that man became a good friend. I'm still in touch with him. When summits occur, and this was no exception, very often they're divided into at least two parts. The president and his opposite number talk about pleasant things they've seen and done and plan to do. The Secretary of State and his opposite number, in this case, an old veterinarian from the Long March named Chi Peng-fei, who was acting foreign minister. This was the Cultural Revolution. There was nobody in a formal position. Chi Peng-fei and the Secretary of State talked about all the things we disagreed about. It was very important to do that because we had to reaffirm our differences in order to reassure our respective client states and friends. Chinese had to worry about Hanoi's reaction, about Pyongyang's reaction, about Pakistan's reaction, but we had to worry about the opposite numbers to those countries. The interpreting was interesting. The Chinese at that time used a vocabulary which was very prejudicial in many cases. It did not convey the nuances of the English. Several times I got into arguments, as Nick will recall, with the Chinese interpreter, who thought I was using, quote, feudal language, unquote. In any event, I will conclude by saying that while we were arguing in a very useful manner between the Secretary of State and his counterpart, Henry Kissinger and Qiao Guanghua were off putting the finishing touches on the draft that we had worked on earlier of the Shanghai Communique. And I'll just mention that my only contribution to that really was to stick in something about opening trade relations and cultural relations. I mention that because there's a revisionist school that imagines the United States was motivated by trade. But in fact, trade was totally an afterthought, as was cultural exchange. The second point I'd make on the communique is that when I reviewed the Chinese text, the communique having been negotiated in English, I found that the Chinese interpreters, the translators, had bent over backwards to be fair to the nuances in the American English text. I had a couple of suggestions which were accepted, but they did a superb job. And I think overall, my impression was that despite the isolation, vulnerability, poverty, and the cultural desert that China then was, those with whom we were dealing were men and women of the first order, sophisticated, well-informed, tough, but able to compartmentalize their political views from their personal interactions with us. And I'll end there.
Thank you very, very much, Chaz. I learned some new things about the trip from your remarks. Thanks for that. Thanks also for sticking close to time. Nick, we'll turn it over to you. How did the trip and the communique look from your perspective as a member of the State Department delegation?
I studied Chinese starting in 1960, and then went to Hong Kong as a China watcher, and I spent the next 10 years focused on China. And I told the powers that be that I would like a job that would tell me something about diplomacy and about what the Department of State did. So they said, fine, there's a job in the Secretariat staff, which manages the Secretary's day. And at that point, this was before the trip was envisaged. Anyway, William Rogers asked around to say, is there anybody in my outfit that knows anything about China? Well, they said, there's a guy who's just joined your staff and he knows a lot about China. So Rogers interviewed me and he said, I would like you to come with me as my aide. My aide is a Latin American specialist. I said, I'd be delighted. And so I then found myself in a locked room with Chaz and all the people that I've known all my professional life. And we started writing papers for the secretary to use on the trip. And of course, as Chaz has told you, there was a lot of duplication and they were good papers. But that's how I got involved. Now, when we went to China, there were actually 3 planes involved. One was the president's plane. Then there was a backup plane in case something happened to the president's plane. And then there was a plane full of newspapermen and women. Now, the scene shifts to Beijing on a cold February day. My plane has just arrived and I'm being led and placed behind the engines of the president's plane, which has just landed. And Joe and Lai is waiting for President Nixon to come down the stairs. And the question in everybody's mind was, will he and will Joe and will Joe and the Secretary of State shake hands? Because years before, John Foster Dulles had refused to shake Joe and Lai's hand at a big meeting in Geneva. Anyway, President comes down the stairs. Everybody else is held in the plane. I'm standing behind the engines with my movie camera, and the president and Joe and Lai shake hands, and they shake hands, and they shake hands some more. So that, was the way the meetings began, with everybody making a strong point about shaking hands and doing things together. We all jumped into our cars and drove through what was a totally deserted Beijing. The government was very worried about this meeting and that something might go wrong. And so they kept us in a bubble. And we were in this bubble. We went to the state guest house. We started our trips, started our talks. There were 3 sets of talks. One was Joe and Nixon talking about the world. One was Secretary Rogers and Xi Pengfei, the foreign minister, talking about very sort of mundane issues that we would have to face as 2 governments trying to solve problems, trade, travel, legal issues, and cultural exchange. And the 3rd set of talks was Kissinger and Xiao Guanhua, the vice foreign minister, who had been instrumental in developing the Shanghai Communique, and they were talking about the shape of the communique. Now, this was the first time that the U.S. and China had had anything to do with each other for a long time. Both sides saw it as an opportunity to educate the American people about China. So each day started with a telegenic event involving the president, Great Wall, all the great sites, and it would end at supper time with another telegenic event. The gymnasts of the two countries competing with each other, et cetera, et cetera. So in between that telegenic sandwich, there were talks. And the talks on the three subjects of the many subjects proceeded apace. The Beijing part of the trip came to an end, and we then moved to Hangzhou. The one thing that had not happened was that the negotiators of the Shanghai Communique had not shown it to anybody else except the Chinese. They'd gone ahead and they had gotten approval of the Shanghai Communique from the Chinese Central Committee, but no one from the State Department. And Marshall Green was there, and the Secretary of State, and way down the line, me. And so we got a look at the Shanghai Communique on the plane to Hangzhou, and there were a couple of things that needed attention. And so we had to go to Secretary of State, and Marshall Green had to go to the president and say, look, this may be approved by the Central Committee, but there's a couple of errors here that need to be dealt with. They were very furious. So, but
Nick,
that
excuse
got
me,
done.
can you wrap up, please, Nick?
Yes, I'm going to stop right now.
Oh, don't do that.
Anyway, later on, and I'll tell you in my second tranche, we put all this right. And that was the worm's eye view of the trip. Me being the worm.
Well, thank you, Nick. Totally fascinating again. I've learned new things from both of you. As Nick said, we now move on to each of our panelists giving a second tranche of remarks. And this is on the question of what the consequences of the visit and the Shanghai Communique were. How were they received at home, inside China, by friends and allies? What was the impact? How did they, the president famously said in one of his toasts that this was the week that changed the world. Well, did it change the world? And if so, how? And we'll go back to Chaz to get the second set of comments going.
Well, I think it did change the world geopolitically right then, and we understood that. I want to add a small comment, if I may, on the absence of an interpreter at the Mao Zedong Nixon meeting. There were no Chinese speakers on the American side there, which is not a good practice. It was one that Nixon followed, not just with the Chinese, but with the Soviets out of paranoia, concerned that an American interpreter might be reachable by the press and be the source of leaks. but this leads to mistakes. For example, Mao, in referring to the Taiwan issue, used the phrase, we can wait or whatever, 100年以后吧. And this was duly recorded as a commitment to wait 100 years to solve the Taiwan issue. But that phrase is a standard phrase in Chinese, which means after I'm dead and gone. In other words, this is not going to get solved in my lifetime. That has nothing to do with 100 years. You pay a price if you exclude the sort of expertise that Nick and I and others in the State Department team might have provided. The trip set in motion a process which resulted the following year, 1973, in the exchange of liaison offices, something which both Nick and I were involved with. Nick stayed on, I left. And this was important because very soon, in 1974, both sides suffered succession crises. Watergate struck down Nixon, and the Gang of Four rose to power in Beijing. And so it was a very good thing that we had institutionalized the relationship in the way we did. Gerald Ford was unable to carry out Nixon's pledge to achieve normalization of relations during his term of office. He didn't have the political clout. That fell to Jimmy Carter. That happened at the end of 1978 with a communique dated January 1, 1979. The question is, why did Deng Xiaoping, who had come back to power, why did he choose that moment to reach a historic compromise with the United States on some of the issues that divided us? And there were two answers. One, he was deeply concerned strategically about the Soviet sphere of influence that Hanoi was busily constructing along with an empire to China's south. And he wanted to teach Vietnam a lesson, the lesson being that you cannot carry out these activities with impunity. He succeeded, but at a huge cost, much higher in blood and treasure than he had expected. The second and far more important and less obvious reason, obvious only in retrospect, was that he wanted to use the opening of relations to the United States to de-Sovietize China, to replace the Soviet model with eclectic borrowing from best practices everywhere, but with a major emphasis on the United States. So I will not provide further recollections of the trip itself. Perhaps those can be done in the Q&A or comments section. But I would note that the dominant theme of this trip is summed up in a Chinese phrase, 求同存异, to seek common ground while setting aside differences. This was exactly that model. The United States and China did not come to agreement on any of the regional issues that we were divided about, Korea, Indochina, Kashmir, whatever. But we were able to set aside these differences in order to join forces as the United States switched from using Taiwan to contain China to using China to contain the Soviet Union. That relationship, which began then, really flowered only after the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan directly challenged both Chinese and American interests. That led to a much more active entente between the United States and China. Both of us had programs in Afghanistan to support the Mujahideen. The United States spent about $630 million a year, mostly Saudi money, to buy Chinese weapons for the Mujahideen. The Chinese supplied us with Soviet equipment so that we could train against it. MiG-21s manufactured in Chengdu were airlifted from Beijing to Washington and then to Nellis Air Force Base. Similarly, we established an intelligence relationship, which enabled us to monitor and be aware of the Soviet activity. This was a period of mutual discovery, as Nick said, aided and abetted, perhaps galvanized by television coverage at the outset. A great surprise to the American people to see this great civilization now dressed in blue boiler suits, to be sure, but still quite evident. I think that began a cycle in US-China relations, which continued for some time. On cycles, this has probably been the most volatile relationship between great powers in the last 100 years. We have been allies against Japan, enemies in Korea, opponents in the 1960s in the Cultural Revolution, partners against the Soviets in the 70s, engaged intensely in the 1980s, disillusioned by the Tiananmen student and worker uprising in 1989, in the 1990s, in search of China's integration into the global order. In the first part of the 21st century, inching toward renewed antagonism. And finally, in the second decade of the 21st century, we achieved antagonism. The relationship now, in many ways, from a military point of view, is as bad as it has been since the 1950s. Politically, it's as bad as it has been since the 1970s. Economically, it is very robust, but troubled. Culturally, we are afflicted, as I'm sure Julia will mention in her concluding remarks, by a degree of cultural suspicion and estrangement, the xenophobia in the United States, and equal antagonism to the United States now among Chinese, that is deeply troubling and very dysfunctional. I'll end here.
Thanks very much, Chaz. Nick, I'll turn to you. Basically, what Chaz has said is that it did reorient US-China relations in a more positive direction, but that didn't last, and things began to go sour. How would you interpret what the visit and the communique did and did not do with regard to US-China relations and perhaps geopolitics and geoeconomics more generally?
Well, the Nixon trip allowed us the opportunity to actually shape the relationship to come. And the liaison offices, and I was sent to open one of them along with Chaz, provided the infrastructure for people-to-people contacts to begin. And we were not prepared for the actual surge of curiosity by the peoples of both countries about each other. And that first year in '73, there were many, many delegations that came and went and started the people-to-people link between the two governments and the two peoples. Henry Kissinger called the issues that we discussed nuts and bolts issues, things that dealt with trade, travel, cultural exchange, et cetera, et cetera. And he said, you guys in the State Department, you can deal with those. I'm going to deal with the, the three-way diplomacy that we've begun. Well, that came to a quick end because, principles died. But the nuts and bolts issues became the subject matter for the two countries to deal with. And among these, of course, were cultural exchange and so forth and trade. And they prospered. They prospered at the outset. And in fact, they're still going. And although the atmosphere is a little, is less, how would I say, it's a lot less cordial, it's still become the biggest bilateral relationship that we have, with the exception of Canada. So actually, the Nixon trip gave us permission to go and follow the interests of the two countries in having relations with each other. And the issues were more mundane, but they've lasted. For example, the Philadelphia Orchestra came, Eugene Ormandy came, I was his control officer, and we hit a really, really resounding nerve in China with classical music. The Chinese loved it, and they wanted more of it, and they wanted to teach each other about it. And it still goes on today. And the relationship between the Philadelphia Orchestra and China is very much of a going concern. So the Nixon trip, while we were all cloistered at that time and kept from the Chinese people, was the beginning, and we took it from there. And during the liaison office days, we were allowed to have as much contact with the Chinese as we could manage. And that was extremely important. I'll stop there.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I think we now can turn to the Q&A. We've got some good ones coming in, and then we'll invite Julia when we finish the Q&A to give. I'm sorry, I'm being advised that we should have Julia come now. Sorry, Julia, and to give her commentary from her perspective. You might want to tell us where you were during the trip and the publication of the communique, and how you reacted to it, and how the Chinese American community reacted to it.
Well, Harry, thank you. We just heard from two wonderful experts who were actually on the original Nixon delegation. I think we would all agree that they have enriched our understanding of the significance and impact of the week that changed the world. And I thank them. What I want to share with you is not so much a commentary, but some reminiscences of an immigrant from Shanghai, for whom President Nixon's visit to her birthplace in 1972 became a seminal event. It would change my life. I was then working in the US Senate for Senator Charles H. Percy, a Republican from Illinois. Our China, how should I put it? My portfolio was covering for Senator Percy.
Yes.
Because you said you can ask the questions.
I'm sorry? Did somebody say something? Harry, you're muted. Can you hear me?
I can hear you fine, but unfortunately, I was not supposed to speak, and I didn't have my microphone on mute. It's my fault. So,
So what I was just talking about my portfolio with Senator Charles H. Percy. I covered the domestic policies, ranging from health, education, and welfare, to agriculture and nutrition, to his work on women and aging issues. I didn't have time to give one thought to foreign policy or China, as much as I envied those who worked for him on the Foreign Relations Committee. As an immigrant, I was intent on becoming an American. So my job and portfolio suited me just fine at that time. Then the Nixon shock. For a week, from February 21 to 28 in 1972, I was glued to the television set, mesmerized by the images on the screen, like so many of my family and friends. We hadn't seen anything of China for 21 years. We left in 1951. For most people, watching China on TV was like watching the moon landing. China then was as strange as the moon to most Americans. But for me, it captured the mystery of China that I only vaguely remembered. It was better than any travel log because the subject had been forbidden fruit. Not even the endless televised banquets and mass toastings at the Great Hall of the People bored me. I just couldn't get enough of it. My parents were even more excited when the TV showed the delegation touring Hangzhou. My mother cried because her favorite place in the world was the West Lake in Hangzhou. And when the delegation got to Shanghai and stayed at the Jingjiang Hotel, where the Shanghai Communique was signed, my father waxed nostalgic, which he seldom did. His club had been there. My father, or rather my mother's family home, was in the neighborhood, and she often went to the movie theater nearby with her siblings and friends. The TV made China come alive, and it turned China, the enemy, into human beings. TV allowed Americans to see the Chinese in all their humanity, having resigned to the fact that we would probably never see China again. Nixon's visit aroused our longing, like for all immigrants, to perhaps, maybe, go home again. Before Nixon, my parents never talked much about China. But after Nixon, my father was determined to visit China one last time. And it was my job to get it done. And I did. My mother and her mahjong friends began to also open up, began to talk about the good old days. And I would, whenever I could, sit to watch them play and talk, just like the mahjong ladies in Amy Tang's best-selling novel, The Joy Luck Club, and the popular film that followed. I hope most of you know what I'm talking about. My mother and her mahjong friends were denizens of Shanghai's golden age, when it was known as the Paris of the Orient. They were from Shanghai's moneyed class, survived the Japanese invasion in 1937, fled to ancestral homes when the Japanese occupied the international settlement in 1941. We lived in the French concession. Well, I should say we. I wasn't born then, but my parents lived in the French concession. And they began leaving China in 1945, when the country plunged into war, into civil war, ending with the victory of Mao Zedong's communists in 1949. These ladies harbored no love for the PRC. Their reminiscences were full of nostalgia for a treasured life and society that were no more, for the loss of family, friends, the sense of belonging, even the sense of self. For those with connections to Taiwan, they felt completely betrayed. It had been unthinkable that the most virulent red baiter in American politics at the time would abandon Taiwan and embrace the PRC. In fact, Nixon's visit actually divided the Chinese American community even further. But in those days, there were not too many pro-PRC Chinese immigrants. Most had left the PRC because of the PRC or the communists. But even these ladies could not help but watch television as Nixon and his delegation made their way from Beijing to Hangzhou, then to Shanghai. Hangzhou evoked their happiest memories of outings with loved ones that they would never see again, boating trips, and eating at famous restaurants by the West Lake. As a way of keeping those cherished memories, I noticed that my mother and her mahjong friends always drank Longjing tea from Hangzhou. Interestingly, the pain and suffering of China's Cultural Revolution, which was in full swing in 1972, was never mentioned at the mahjong table, even though every family in the group was affected. But I don't think we really knew anything that was happening. My parents sent remittances to our family in China. That's how they survived. But the exchange of letters was perfunctory. Nothing interesting in any of the letters. Only later, when my family visited China in 1978, did we learn how many of our friends and family members had been persecuted, struggled against, some even persecuted to death. Even before normalization relations in 1979, I would take 2 trips to China. In 1977, with the American Council of Young Political Leaders, and in 1978, with my family. It was too late for me to become a Chinese scholar, as I lost my Chinese in my haste to become American. But I managed to steer my career to international affairs. But I never managed to get a job to work on China. So I created my own by conceiving the U.S.-China Education Trust on the campus of Peking University in 1998. And Professor Wang Jishi, who unfortunately just could not join us tonight, was the first Chinese I interviewed about American studies in China. And I'm glad to see that he is now the honorary president of the Chinese American Studies Association. The Nixon visit brought me back to China. My biggest impression after all these years is that human connections are the most important antidotes to war and aggression. The value of Nixon's visit goes beyond geopolitics. He opened the door for American and Chinese people to see, to know, to interact with each other. He led the way for President Jimmy Carter and Paramount Leader Deng Xiaoping to open the floodgate for education people-to-people exchange. I hope the legacy of the week that changed the world in 1972 will endure. I hope the US and China will not play the geopolitical chess game that Putin is playing in the Ukraine, not just playing, acting out in the Ukraine, putting the world in danger of a possible World War III.
Yes.
Let me conclude by saying that the US-China relationship, from my perspective, is one of necessity, not of choice. unless the US and China can make the best of it, there will be no global peace or prosperity, or perhaps even survival. I'm sorry to end on such a dark note, but today is not a good day.
Thank you very much, Julia. Of course, it's sad to end on a sad note, but sometimes it's necessary to do so. We can now turn to questions, and we can continue to add to the list, but let me start with a few. And although this may be a little bit difficult for those who have not studied Chinese to follow, there are a couple of questions for Chaz about translation. And I think we've seen in the US-China relationship, as in any relationship between two countries that have different languages, translation is important, and getting the translation right is essential. Getting it wrong can have consequences. So we have a couple of questions about it, Chaz, with regard to the Shanghai communique. One is the phrase with which the United States addressed the Taiwan question. And of course, it said that the United States acknowledges that Chinese on either side of the Taiwan Strait maintain that there is but one China, and Taiwan is a part of China. The United States does not challenge that position. And there are a couple of questions about this. I'll add one of my own. But one question is basically, why was the word acknowledge chosen? Especially for viewers who are familiar with the normalization agreement, that word played a major role there, but a different Chinese term was used. So the question is, maybe Nick can also speak to this choice of the word acknowledge and then the meaning of does not challenge. My question is the way in which Chinese was translated. I hadn't even thought about that until preparing for our talk tonight. I asked my research assistant to look it up. And in essence, it was the term that was used was 中国人 as opposed to 华人. In other words, basically a political definition was used as opposed to what do we want to say, an ethnic definition. So in these ways, there are some translation issues, and several of us asking questions are interested in how you would respond to them, or other questions of translation that may have come up.
The word acknowledge, as rendered in Chinese as 认识到, is stronger than take note of, less strong than recognize, an intermediate term. It means we are aware of. It has something of that flavor in English. Let me just say that no two languages ever have a precise overlap of nuance and meaning between words. And it would be remarkable indeed if languages as unrelated as Chinese and Indo-European languages like English did have such an overlap. That was a good choice by the Chinese. It gave the benefit of the doubt to us. It was exactly what I referred to in my opening remarks when talking about the Chinese actually giving us the benefit of the doubt and when there were choices to be made on translation. The use of the word 中国人, meaning Chinese nationals or Chinese, was entirely appropriate because we were talking about a situation in which an unended civil war had occurred. Actually, in the 1950s, John Foster Dulles and Christian Herter tried to persuade Chiang Kai-shek to agree to separate Taiwan from the rest of China. Jiang, we now know, wrote a letter to Zhou Enlai taking credit for stopping that in defense of the one China principle, which he strongly believed in. Now, there was no disagreement whatsoever between Chinese and Taipei, Chinese establishment in Taipei, which was the government we recognized at the time, and the people in Beijing about the use of the word 中国人, and that was not controversial. It became controversial later when the Taiwan independence movement came up and people in Taiwan began to assert, some of them began to assert, that they were not Chinese. So this was before identity politics had really had taken hold.
Right. Thank you very much.
Let me add a point here
Sure.
about the communique and the State Department's problems with the communique. And these were set off all kinds of alarm bells with the Chinese because they thought that perhaps our whole delegation was split into two factions, one represented by the State Department's point of view, and the other, I'm sorry, my phone is ringing, but it'll stop. When we were in Shanghai, when we got to Shanghai, we were unpacking, and all of a sudden, Zhou Enlai arrived. Now, the idea, and he arrived with several interesting political figures. This was at the guest house. The Chinese invented protocol, and the idea of a prime minister calling on a cabinet officer at his hotel was just unheard of. But anyway, Zhou Enlai had a great deal invested in this trip, and he wanted to find out if our delegation was in fact divided. And Rogers assured him that it was not, and that these issues that we had could easily be dealt with. And but the fact that Joe called on Rogers in Shanghai took years to come out because it was so unusual. But it also indicated the importance that the Chinese attached to this trip being a success.
Thank you. Another question that's interesting is what were the most difficult issues that were addressed in negotiating the communique? Now, let me put a little bit of a gloss on that by saying that, of course, what was unique about the structure of the communique was that it acknowledged differences as well as tried to identify common interests. And that was seen even now, as it was then, as a breakthrough in how to structure a communique between two countries. It's also said, however, that the statement of differences in effect was also negotiated. Each side stated their position, as has already been said, to reassure allies, to reassure domestic publics that there were still some principles and policies that each side was committed to. But I'm told that basically the way in which those statements of long-held views and policies was worded was also negotiated. So I'm wondering if that is true, and if you could say more about how this delicate balance between where we agree and where we disagree, how that was struck.
I can't comment on that because I don't know the answer. Maybe Chaz does, but the fact of the matter was that our ability to describe what our differences were was just as important as our ability to describe what we agreed on.
The idea that we would open with a statement of differences came from Zhou Enlai, and it was a brilliant diplomatic innovation, which, as you said, Harry, is quite unusual. The text of the differences was negotiated in the talks between Kissinger and Xiao Guanhua, but the substance came from the Rogers discussions with Ji Pengfei, which of course didn't break any new ground. They weren't intended to on this subject. Nick has mentioned the last session we had with Ji Pengfei when we did discuss a whole series of troublesome details. For example, claims for ancient railway bonds, which had been foisted on the Chinese by William Howard Taft, and which actually helped set off the Xinhai-Gaming, the 1911 revolution, because they were so unpopular in China. So we went over a lot of very difficult issues like this, and we discussed how we would stay in touch. And we made a commitment to try to work out arrangements for dealing with these issues, as well as trade and other matters.
Thank you. Another question that has to do with both the communique and the trip. I can slightly paraphrase this way. As far as the trip was concerned, the question is, do you both agree that the process of engagement, of dialogue, including at the highest level, still is a valid approach to US-China relations 50 years on? You'll recall that not a few Americans in recent years have argued that basically engagement should be dead. It's a dead policy, and I'm wondering how you would respond to that. And the related question is that the communique that the process of engagement in 1972 produced, what do you see as its status today? Is it still the basis of the relationship, or has it 50 years on been somewhat overtaken by events? An interesting historic document that carries few implications for the present.
Dick, you want to start?
Yeah, I'll just say a couple of things. First of all, the issues that we dealt with were very important. They were, as I said, rather mundane. I remember when I wrote my book, Henry Kissinger asked, what was my book about? What was the main point? Well, the main point was that the nuts and bolts won out. The nuts and bolts were more important to the future of the relationship than the actual three-way diplomacy. Anyway, it's very important in the Chinese hierarchical way of thinking to bless dialogue by starting it at the top and by periodically visiting the top with interlocutors. And so I think it's just an important structural element of any dialogue between us.
Let me answer this a different way, Harry. I think there's a problem, a generational problem in American views of China, because so much time has gone on. Nobody's read the communiques except perhaps the people on this screen. Nobody knows what's in them. Nobody's read the Taiwan Relations Act, for that matter. It's rather like Trump's vision of the Constitution, which contains all sorts of material that the founding fathers actually never put in there. So we have references to these documents, which are seminal documents by people who've never read them. Quite remarkable. The second point is people forget what the state of US-China relations was. We had fought a bitter war in Korea. If you go to the US Marine Corps Museum in Quantico, you'll find that the Battle of Choisin Reservoir is the seminal event in the Corps' history, the toughest battle they ever fought. We had spent, as I said, 136 different meetings in Warsaw, basically not achieving anything until the end, when we proposed the essence of the formula on Taiwan that the Shanghai Communique incorporated. We were enemies. China wanted to overthrow the world order that we'd established. People forget this. Engagement is a pretty good alternative to war and revolutionary contention. And so I think the question, frankly, although I agree it's topical, lacks context. And I'll make another comment, and that is that one of the virtues of Henry Kissinger in this context was that he had written the definitive work on the balance of power in Europe, and the efforts of his hero, Metternich, to incorporate France back into the councils of Europe after the Napoleonic Wars. He knew that Metternich had basically pulled the fangs of the French Revolution and restored France to its responsible position in European governance. When we failed to do that after World War I and isolated great powers in Europe, Germany and the Soviet Union, and excluded them from management, we got World War II and the Cold War. So Kissinger was very much interested in the abstract, in exactly what Nick was talking about, namely all the little details of connections between bureaucracies, institutions, scientists, and so forth, that weave the fabric of a relationship that has some tensile strength and a bit of resilience to it. And as Nick said, I think when we had political difficulties, it was the human connections that got us through them. Your final question, are the communiques relevant? They are terribly relevant. Unfortunately, as I said, they're not read or remembered here. There's been an enormous amount of salami slicing by the United States on the commitments with regard to Taiwan. And that, plus the emergence of Taiwan identity politics, is what is producing the, in my view, fairly likely resumption of a violent confrontation in the Taiwan Strait, this time probably involving the United States as well as the two parties in the area.
Julia, would you like to comment on any of these questions?
I would just say that, no, I want to ask an additional question.
Sure.
Since Wang Jisi is not here, I think we can discuss this. And even if he were here, I would like to ask this question. Do you think, what do you think Putin's actions in the Ukraine, what do you think it does to US-China relations? And particularly, what do you think it does? How do you think it will affect China's moves on Taiwan?
Shall I start?
Please.
China fully shares Russia's objections to the extension of an American sphere of influence through NATO to the borders of Russia. It analogizes this to the Taiwan issue. Taiwan is part of an American sphere of influence that includes what it regards as part of China. So it is totally on board with Putin's demands for renegotiation of European security architecture to make it reassuring to Russia rather than apparently menacing. China also shares Russia's apprehensions about NATO, which was once correctly portrayed as a purely defensive alliance, but which went on to dismember Serbia and hive off Kosovo, to intervene in pacification efforts in Afghanistan, and to carry out regime change operations from the air in Libya. These are not defensive acts. So on that level, China and Russia are together. On the other hand, China is the last citadel of Westphalianism. It strongly supports the idea of sovereignty and immunity from interference in internal affairs. And so it has a dilemma. Putin, I think they were probably fine with Putin as long as he was carrying out a course of coercive diplomacy backed by shows of force. They are now squirming visibly as he ups the ante He's no longer simply trying to deny Ukraine to the American sphere of influence. He appears to be trying to incorporate it into a new Russian sphere of influence. I don't think China is comfortable at all with this. I know that the Chinese have never recognized the separation of Kosovo from Serbia or Crimea from Ukraine. And I think it's too early to say what will happen in Ukraine and what the implications are. With respect to the implications for Taiwan, they're obvious. If coercive diplomacy backed by the use of force can succeed in producing a negotiated adjustment on the part of the United States with respect to Taiwan, then China will see this as a model. If China sees that it cannot produce a negotiation, then it will confirm the growing impression in Beijing that there is no path to a peaceful resolution of the Taiwan issue, and that therefore at some point the use of force will be necessary. And so I think those are the connections. I think the final point is there's a lot of talk in the United States often, and certainly on this issue, about military credibility. If we don't react militarily, our credibility will be damaged. Somehow lost in this is the concept of diplomatic credibility. At the moment, given the salami slicing I've mentioned, as well as other US actions, invasions of Iraq and other things, we have very little diplomatic credibility generally, and none at all in Beijing. So it is very difficult to figure out how we might refashion a modus vivendi over the Taiwan issue. So that is a key consideration here.
Thank you. You mentioned a few minutes ago that there's been a generational change in the United States. And as you defined it, Chaz, it was that fewer and fewer people are really familiar with some of these key documents that came out of the Nixon visit, and then came out of the normalization agreement in 1978, and then came out of the Taiwan Relations Act. And that is probably certainly true. Memories are short, and the amount of material that's covered in many courses on these issues, let's put it this way, the amount of material expands, and therefore the amount that can be studied and remembered is less. But there's another generational change that some people have, mutual friends of all of us, have mentioned, and that is a generational change simply in how different generations have experienced China. Those as a kind of a cultural revolution generation that may have been kind of sympathetic to leftism in the United States, who viewed China one way. Then there was the reform era that was even more optimistic and in a more liberal way. Then there was the more recent period where China seems perhaps less admirable. The experiences were less positive. And I'm wondering if you would agree with that characterization, Nick and Chaz. Has there been a generational change in that sense in how generations of Americans have changed their views of China? Does it matter? Why did it occur if you think it has?
One of the things that sets the US-China relationship apart is that there's an enormous participation by people who are not in the government. And there's a lot of people-to-people contact, which comes about as a result of them having seen things together, eye to eye, and so forth. And also the simple, what should I say, force of events requiring that people on either side respond. Now, there's nothing like this in the US-Russian relationship. It's mostly government to government, and the Chinese-US relationship is very much affected by people-to-people links, which have died away, but not off completely. So I point to this as a major difference. And the younger generation that's coming along has to figure out its own way of communicating with each other.
Heraclitus said you can't step in the same river twice. You can't visit the same China twice. And I think it makes a tremendous difference if, when you visited China, you saw the cultural desert, the poverty and the weakness that we saw in 1972, or whether you saw the socialist sloth and indolence that Deng Xiaoping combated in the 1980s, or whether you're now dealing with one of the 400 venture capital firms in China that are supporting small and medium-sized enterprise. So when you encountered China and the China you encountered make a huge difference in your attitude. There's one constant factor, however, which I've noted, and I think probably Nick had the same experience. I was the DCM charge at the American Embassy in Beijing from 1981 to 1984, 4 years, which was a dramatic moment of change in China as Deng's reforms unfolded. And I saw many people, Europeans, Americans, others, arrive in China starry-eyed about what was happening in China. And within 6 months, the oppressive surveillance and harassment they suffered from the security services turned them from ardent friends of China into more than skeptics, often opponents of China. Now, part of this may simply have been culture shock, but it's been a persistent theme. And I dare say that the misbehavior under the China initiative of the FBI in the United States has had much the same effect on Chinese here. So I think which China you encountered makes a difference. Whether you're aware of the extent to which China and its relations with the world have changed makes a difference. Your personal experience of China and the Chinese makes a difference. And in that regard, the bureaucratism and xenophobia of security services on both sides are really a threat to the solid relationships between people that we've seen and which we continue to need.
Another question brings us back to geopolitics. And of course, at the time of the visit and for many years after, people looking at the Nixon visit said that the United States was able to play the China card against the Soviet Union as part of our competition with the Soviet Union in those years. The Chinese looked at it in a slightly different way, as China being the balancer, being the pivot in a relationship between the United States. I remember the Chinese strategist Huan Xiang said at one point that even though China was a far weaker country at that time than either the United States or the Soviet Union, as he put it, I think this is right, a 1 ounce weight can still determine the balance between 2 1-ton weights. And so the questioner is asking whether the United States could be the pivot between the Soviet Union and, Russia and China, as some Americans have suggested it be, or how would you describe this triangular relationship these days? Is there a card to be played? If so, by whom? Who has the pivotal position, if anybody does?
Maybe I'll start, or go ahead, Nick.
No, you go ahead. I was just going to say flippantly, that's the question that Mr. Kissinger would like to answer.
I think we have a major conceptual problem in the way we think about international relations diplomacy in this country. The word ally is bandied about with great abandon, and all it seems to mean is having a cordial relationship. But technically, an alliance is a mutual commitment to aid. And an alliance like NATO is unconditional. I think we need to refine our vocabulary. What the United States established with China in the 70s and previously in the 1940s during World War II was what I would call a protected state status. We had no expectations that the Chinese would do very much of anything for us, but their existence was important in keeping the geopolitical chessboard favorable to us. World War II, we aided the Chinese government so it could tie down Japanese forces, which otherwise would have been deployed elsewhere. In the 1970s, we aided China with intelligence and other goods and services because it had been threatened by the Soviet Union, and had it been either removed from the chessboard or humiliated, that would have represented a very detrimental geopolitical change. What China and the Soviet Union, or sorry, the Russians, as you I have the same problem you do, Harry. What China and the Russians now have is not an alliance, but an entente, which is a term that means a limited partnership for limited purposes, possibly for a limited time. Unfortunately for us, the entente is all about opposing American unilateralism and disregard for the UN Charter and international law in favor of something we call the rules-bound order, where we make the rules and decide which ones will apply to whom, including us. So I think we now face a major challenge of a nature we've not seen before, because this entente is a direct result of our having pressed both sides together, one from the West, one, and we see that now in Ukraine and the reactions there from the Russians, and one in the East, where we see the South China Sea and the Taiwan issue now approaching a boil.
I think we have time for one more question and then brief answers from all three of you. I teach a course on leadership in American policy towards China. And one of the students pointed out a surprising passage in Henry Kissinger's book on China, where he said that basically the rapprochement between the United States and China was inevitable, given the state of international affairs at the time. And therefore, it really didn't matter who were the leaders. And we have a question of whether powerful leaders mattered in this process on either or both sides. So how important were Mao and Nixon in making this happen? Would any two leaders in that situation have done the same thing? Would it have taken longer, gone less smoothly? How would each of the three of you answer that?
I would say that political will was crucial in bringing the United States and China together. And you needed very, very strong leadership on both sides in order to start this off. These roles were not interchangeable. Mao himself had a lot of political power, and so did Nixon. And they both wanted this, and they made it happen. And they had in Joe and in Kissinger what I would call masterful technicians, tacticians, who were able to bring it all together.
I couldn't agree more with that. Chaz, and then Julia.
Well, I agree with Nick. Nixon and Mao were both men of deeply flawed character, as we know from Watergate and from revelations of Mao's behavior over the years. But both were statesmen, both understood geopolitics, and both had the will to produce change. Now, that wasn't easy in the United States, and it wasn't easy in China. And I don't think it's the case that some of the subsequent leaders we've had in either country would have had the force of will and the vision to accomplish what they did.
Thank you. Julia?
Well, I think what has been said, I agree with. I don't mean to be flippant, but I think personalities matter. It's not just the circumstances, but the context. And just imagine we had President Trump. Could he have taken the place of Nixon? I don't see that at all.
Well, thank you very much. And ladies and gentlemen, our time is just up. We're about 1 minute over. And I know that for some of you, you're just getting to work and getting going. If you're in Asia here, you're probably getting fairly tired. But I think we've had a really interesting discussion from which I've learned a lot of facts that I did not know before, as well as some very good interpretations of the importance of both the visit and the communique, and some thoughts about what we can learn moving forward. So on that note, I will close by thanking first Julia Chang-Block and her colleagues at the U.S.-China Education Trust for conceiving of this program and pulling it together. Join her in expressing our regrets that Wang Jise could not join us tonight. And to thank both Nick and Chaz for their participation, for their reminders of important facts that we may have forgotten and insights that we need to remember. So on that note, I will wish everybody a good day or a good evening, and thank you all for joining us today. Bye-bye.
And
Bye-bye.
thank you, Harry. Thank you for running a great show.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.